Okay, so welcome to our FinTech Leaders Panel discussion, and we're going to be discussing sustainability, something we've already talked about quite a lot today, but this is specifically about this topic. So please welcome back to the stage from earlier on, we have Sahil Raja. They're too busy talking backstage. Just here, please, Sahil. And Stephen Jury. And Stephen Roche. And Gabino Roche Jr. Okay, right, we're going to dive straight in here because, as I said, we've talked about sustainability quite extensively. But we are going to be talking about ESG goals and everything relating to FinTech, hopefully. As usual, we will take some questions from the floor. So at any stage, if you have a question, try and catch my eye and I'll make sure a microphone comes your way. So starting with, we've got two Stephens. This is going to be difficult, isn't it? Stephen, starting with you, what are ESG goals, why are ESG goals essential for FinTechs?
Well, it's the trend. The industry is moving this way, and if you don't keep it top of mind, you're not going to be as relevant. So the key piece, and I was talking with Stephen and Sohail before, is do you have good data to be able to talk about ESG? And I think one of the themes that I'm going to be hitting on is, in my personal humble opinion, it's mostly stickers and tags and labels. What I think everyone cares about when they talk about ESG is the substance behind it. And I think something that for the industry and investors to think about is there is an individual responsibility and each corporation's responsibility to really do the homework and understand if an investment or organization is truly ESG, because there's a lot of easy things you could do in terms of just achieving the checkbox and the label of being ESG.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, Gabino. Do you think, Stephen Roche, do you think it's more than just ticking boxes? Because maybe some people could be accused of just doing that. It's quite easy to go through ESG goals or targets and go, oh yeah, we do that, and tick a box rather than really diving into it.
It is easy, but as an entrepreneur and startup that Sapphire has built, I mean, it's also culture that you need to build, and we're talking about individual responsibility. So when we're building a company, we want to make sure we have a good culture and governance for ourselves to be, giving back to society, have a sustainable life, and including all kinds of diverse backgrounds in our business ventures. So I think you might find it with more the legacy businesses out there, find it an avenue to check off that box because it's more difficult for them to make the change perhaps, or they like the way things are as it is. But for a lot of the newer companies, I think it's important, and I think most of them embrace it. And I'll give you one analogy that I talked about with Gabino on the way here about this event is you think about fast foods. Back in the 80s and 90s, people wanted to eat the fast food that tasted great and was convenient for them to get. That has changed dramatically in today's millennial generation that's growing up. They want to eat healthy. They'll spend more money. They'll sit down and wait online for Chipotle, for example, over at McDonald's, right? Because they know that's better for their health in the long term. That culture is getting inside of the workplace today, especially with startups that are willing to do their part to help keep ESG goals in sight.
And if I could just add, he talked about our management team is pretty diverse, but by happenstance, right? You can set goals. I mean, our chief product officer is Uzbeki. Our CTO is a Filipino. Our general counsel is also a Filipino. But and my brother and I are Latinos, right? But we're not brandishing that. And Steve talked about the culture. It doesn't matter what kind of labels you may get if the merit isn't there. And so the merit is actually what makes it happen. And the culture has to embrace that coming from any diverse background to make that happen. I think that's the ideal state. I worry sometimes that you have a superficial goal of creating some optics, but then you don't have the substance behind that, right? So I think that's the balance that firms have to think about.
Yeah, I suppose that's what I was getting to as well. And Stephen Jury, I mean, Stephen Roche there talked about larger companies or legacy institutions maybe finding it harder to make the transition. Is that based on cost or a lack of will to do so?
I don't think it's a lack of will. I think it's often when you look at ESG, I think the challenge is break it down into the different component parts because it's such a massive topic. Are we talking about financial inclusion or mental well-being and mental health in situations where people may struggle to engage with their money or manage their money appropriately? Are we talking about shifting lending and credit policy to the sectors you lend in and the appropriateness of the transition associated with that? So is it right for a bank to continue to lend to, into the oil and gas sector? Well, there's a transition we need to achieve here. Depending on the nature of fueling that transition by enabling the funding or the access to capital to do that, it becomes critical to changing the way organizations work today to continue to flow funding through to those areas. So you need to judge on the medium to long term what the investment is there to do. But I think the point made around data, I think, is critically important. This is an area which is lacking in clarity and the ability to track progress consistently across multiple brands and potentially multiple industries, I guess with an ability to measure the progress we're making. So anything that's moving in the direction of harmonizing some of those measures and metrics to enable leadership teams in any sector, in any organization, to understand where to focus their efforts and how to demonstrate that they are making progress, does a few things. One, to the analogy that what is measured is managed. People can take ownership and drive change, but also you can start to squeeze out potential greenwashing. Because actually, if these are the measures that people need to make progress on, then how are you making progress in these areas, whether it's in relation to climate change or financial inclusion or education? So I don't think it's a cost or a will piece. I think there's many areas that need proper discussion, detailed understanding, and then engage in communication so that people can really get behind the purpose. And I think then large organizations, as well as small or new, can properly engage. And I think regardless of your size, it's not an option anymore. You will be judged, and people will make decisions on whether you are a company they deal with based on your actions, period. That's it. So if you don't lean into this and take some action now, because it's to the conversation we had earlier when I was just walking through some of the shorter-term decision-making, then I think it's going to be very difficult.
So, Hale, Stephen there mentioned about the data, and I think he said something about lack of clarity around the data, and we're talking about almost like a grading system, I suppose, almost, as a way to just see how green or how sustainable, how diverse a company is. Do you think that's where we need to get to? Do we need to have specific metrics in place?
I think it's part of it. Something that we're doing at SG is looking at ESG indices, for example, and using our index capabilities and distribution around that and ability to create those, working with companies that are providing data around that, but also getting data back from our clients as well, to start looking at ESG as a whole and then breaking it down into the three aspects around environmental, social, and the governance, and really getting to a fine level of detail to say, look, this is how we think things are performing at a sector level, at a company level, at an individual level. And that's something that we're focused on. We're also taking the lead from clients as well in terms of what they're looking for, and we're seeing that particularly the investment houses and the asset management houses and hedge funds are looking to divest away from fossil fuels, for example, coal and whatnot, but they're looking to divest very quickly because obviously they have their own pressures in terms of PR, but also their business, but also from their shareholders that are also putting demands on them to see how quickly and what strategies they can put in place to divest, but also to invest to keep that shareholding, that share price at a level that shareholders would be comfortable with. And I just wanted to go one quick point on the FinTechs angle, and I think that's going to help FinTechs, but sometimes we see a bit of a mixed message from tech firms, not just FinTech. So you've got the analogy around food, and we've seen a plethora of online grocery companies being set up. They've all got electric bikes that go, from an environmental perspective, we're environmentally friendly, but from a social perspective, having lots of bikes around, zipping around in small, places where people are dwelling or living, it's not necessarily a social element to it, but they claim they've got very strong ESG credentials. So I think it needs that breakdown of those three parts in order to evaluate that data to see, actually, do you meet those ESG requirements that you're setting out?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Now, investors are obviously demanding robust ESG credentials right now, and our previous speaker, Luke Manning, talked about that at length. Has that changed the landscape for fintechs, do you think, Stephen Roche?
Yeah, it's changed the landscape because if you're looking to grow your business and you want to take money to make that happen, you have to address the ESG goals that are in there, right? And also, if you're looking for a workforce that believes in your vision and your culture, you have to keep that vision thriving, that today's generation are looking to gravitate towards that. Anything beyond that, if you're just about the money, they're not going to be married to your vision either. They're just going to know this is a paycheck, this is not a place to work. But as far as the investors that come in to help you achieve their goals, they also want to diversify their portfolio. They want to know that they show a successful company growing, meeting these goals and achievements. They want to show the accolades to the market that it can be done, and this is the model to make it happen.
You talked there about today's generation, which makes me feel quite old. When you say today's generation, are you talking about those dreaded millennials? Is that what you're saying?
Perhaps, yeah, a little of that. But I mean, maybe a little bit older than those millennials. They've been embracing that for a while. So the culture is shifting that way, and a lot of things like the analogies I gave earlier indicating that. I think if people are more accepting of it, and the investors, especially, are just not about a quick buck. They also want to have something more to give back and show that they're investing in well-trusted investments.
And Stephen Roche, I mean, how powerful are these armchair investors, if you like? I mean, we talked about Robinhood in your earlier session, for instance. Do you think that these guys are genuinely going to have a lasting impact on markets, for instance?
It will. They're demanding it, but let me give a thought-provoking point.
Yes, please.
So when I design technology solutions, there are two assumptions that my team and myself make. Users are dumb and lazy. So if you assume that they're dumb and lazy, you're going to create a beautiful user experience, and you're going to assume the lowest common denominator so that people can actually seamlessly understand and pull things together. Stephen, not my brother, was also talking about the need for having good data. So I'll give you another fact. In the United States, General Electric, great company, but they buy carbon tax credits. Why? Because they're polluting massively, okay? They pay 0 US federal income taxes because they paid those carbon taxes, and they're investing in quote unquote green energy. But do you think that was the intent of actually, if you're investing in GE, that they don't pay income taxes and then they get tax benefits with tax credits? It's like making your penance and paying your contrition and saying, I've done my good, someone else is going to keep the environment clean. But that ticks off the ESG box, right, in terms of investment. And so when I talk about users being dumb and lazy, I don't mean that literally. People are busy. They don't necessarily have time, but they want to make it someone else's job to police. And then what happens is the police or the regulators or the investors that influence will look for the sticker. And so you can have something that's really a taxi and you label it a Lamborghini, but because it has the Lamborghini label on it, oh, it must be good, or in this case, ESG. And so you have that GEE example that happens. Now, I think the importance here is there is no way for the individual or corporations to absolve themselves of the responsibility of actually checking and doing their homework, because you're going to have stuff that slips through no matter how good you set up the data. And I think you've got to look at metrics, but the industry actually can innovate faster than the regulators can. And I think it's great that the investors demand it, because it really should be coming from them of what those expectations are. And so in the short term, as we evolve, I think the beautiful thing, as my brother had mentioned before, is that people are embracing healthier food choices, right? That's becoming more of a trend, which is what we want to see. You want to see that coming through because, again, a guy who's lived in the finance world, seen these sticks come in and not carrots, and it causes unintended consequences. Here's one more very good example. The financial crisis in 2008. I don't know about the EU, but in the United States, the FHA and a number of government institutions blessed these mortgages because people wanted to live in their homes. No one's going to want to lose their home, right? But what happens is that these interest rates were superficially low, because since 2001, 9/11, they decided to keep the interest rates low, made the mortgages very cheap with 10 years. So that's why there was a 10-year bubble around 2008, where these term loans then bubbled into high interest and people couldn't keep their houses. And again, that's an example of if you invite a regulator to say, we're creating standards and we're saying what's good and what's bad, it doesn't work. One more example, again, to just emphasize, right? Solyndra was a solar panel company in the US, received $500 million, again, $500 million, and was blessed by the US government. Went bankrupt. That money disappeared. So, and this was something that the government said is a good company to bring in, green energy. So I think what's important is there's got to be a balance where you have a sustainable, profitable business that meet ESG goals and responds to those investors. But I also want us to be very careful about the invitation to say we need standards and we need sticks, because you can have another financial crisis as a result.
I mean, it's well known that we have a financial crisis every decade or so, right? Do we think that fintechs might help to smooth that out, or will it still happen every 10 years?
That's honestly one of our goals at Sapphire. I mean this not in some statement just to sound nice, but it's creating transparency. One of the things that we love about being a SaaS business in the cloud is, I don't think the audience may know this, or maybe you don't realize it, is that everyone has their own system in their own database internally. So on-prem, if you've heard that word before, it's on-premise. It means you have a physical computer or database in Singapore versus New York versus London. When you're talking about, and I'm just talking names in general, Citibank versus JP Morgan versus Goldman, whoever they are, they have their databases and they have to synchronize the data to be on the same page. So there's none of that transparency. If you have it in the cloud, everyone's seeing the same thing at the same time. And if you create an interface where all those parties can actually exchange that information, then there's that transparency. So if you're looking at ESG metrics and whatnot, right? That's where I think fintechs can help. And I think it's responding to those investors to think about what are those metrics that you want to see. Let's start proposing them, making them visible, and get the clients to react to it, because then you can actually make it better over time.
Right. And I can expand on that
Sure.
with fintechs. If you think about the technology that fintechs are bringing, like AI, for example, and cloud technology, okay? That in itself answers a lot of sustainability questions, because you won't need as much physical infrastructure, right? If you have an AI that's involved, like what we're doing with Sapphire, you have less work time. Things are speeding up. That means people don't have to work as late. They have a reduced carbon footprint. Same thing with reducing the data center spaces, because now you have shared infrastructure in the cloud. We work in the Azure, Microsoft, space, but there's Amazon and others that are out there that do the same thing. So that's just one angle where fintechs can bring that just through their technology and help meet those ESG goals.
I think it's interesting on the fintechs helping with future crises. So if I rewind back to 2010, 2011, when 2009, 10, 11, when the SME task force was pulled together and the British Business Bank was kind of discussed and formed off the back of the financial crisis. And then work underway across the SME sector kind of started to stand up the ability for SMEs that have been declined for debt to get the appeals process, which signposts people to alternative lending. And the big focus was on generate a market for alternative lending that was beyond the banks. I guess you fast forward that another 6 or 7 years, the mechanisms were in place for that to work, largely through the established providers, so the incumbents in the market. You hit the pandemic, and governments seek to provide support to SMEs, and the British Business Bank step in. At the point the Bounce Back Loan Scheme was launched, it wasn't possible for the likes of Starling, Tide, Funding Circle to engage, because actually they were not accredited under the process through the British Business Bank. So when I think about actually how to manage the shift we need to see in the way the industry operates, I guess we need to do it at all levels. It's not just about creating businesses that can solve problems and diversify the way people can access capital or feel like they're included, is also important to make sure that works with the system. Whether that's British Business Bank is covered by appropriate regulatory supervision, whether it's PRA, conduct, and competition, and so on. So I think there's a really good learning from that, is that we have to always be on top of the fact that fintechs bring challenge and innovation and creativity to some of the biggest problems faced by the sector. But unless we lean into then changing the way the sector works so that they can actually all scale and respond when issues like another financial crisis or a pandemic were to hit, then in my view, we've failed as an industry, not as individual brands within it. I think what's interesting about investors demanding robust ESG credentials, for me, this just comes down to accountability. I mean, you will be held to account if you don't. People will not buy your products. People will not invest. You are accountable as a leader of any business to demonstrate that you are making progress here. And I think that's an accountability that people should be proud to take and want to lean into, because it's the right thing over the longer term horizon.
Okay, a really good point. Suhail, turning to you next, and obviously how SG and ESG. I was going to say that to break those down, and you use the analogy of the cycle delivery, the grocery deliveries there, and how that might be quite E but not very S, or G but not very S. So for SG, your SG,
Yeah.
how do you break that down? How do you break ESG down? And what's the most significant aspect for fintechs and the wider industry?
I think if we just go back to the fintech point, I think it's about investors. I think investors also need to have ESG credentials as well, right? It's not just a fintech having ESG credentials, whatever that might mean. And if you look at the amount of money that's been put into fintechs, it's an enormous amount, right? And you're talking about another bubble. I'm not sure that's a bubble, and I don't want to be, as a banker, talking about bubbles, but certainly seems to me that there's a flood of money in there which hasn't had a return, therefore they've put it into fintechs, but then not really looked at the value of some of these fintechs. You've had a number of new banks start up, and you go, okay, that's great, back to Stephen's point around creating markets because of what happened in the previous crisis, but these banks aren't profitable, right? They're hiring lots of people, they're spending lots of money in marketing, but actually the end result is, do they make money? Do they make a return back to the investors, or do they make a return back to the shareholders? I think it's still important to keep that in mind. If you do implement an ESG strategy, does it still return some sort of value, either as a revenue to what you're doing or to the shareholders? And I think that's missing a little bit in some of these kind of conversations. The conversations we're having with clients is definitely about, as I mentioned, about de-risking or demystifying some of the investments they've had in terms of unfavorable investments. And then they want to see, what's your social responsibility? What do you do as a firm in terms of your local community, or what do you do in terms of your diversity challenges or statistics or indices around that? And then how do you govern yourself, and how do you approach that both internally but also with your clients, but also with third parties? So we're seeing a lot more of those kind of conversations coming up. So I don't think it's just a one fits all, and I think it's not just banks, it's also investors and also the fintechs themselves that need to look at that as a whole.
Yeah, I've often heard it described as the classic three-legged stool, where you need all three legs there, otherwise it just falls down. Are there any questions from the floor at this stage before we continue? No? Okay. I do have some questions here, so I'm just going to throw one or two of these in here. I'll come back to you again, Suhail, actually. So who controls the markets now? Governments, regulators, or big fund managers?
Wow, that's a loaded one, isn't it? I don't think any of them are in control, right? It's all based on client demand. That's going to be my stock answer on that one. It is. Honestly, we're seeing a lot of demand, a lot of drive from clients by the end of 2022 at least, to have made a strong push into divesting away from unfriendly environmental projects and investing in carbon neutral, carbon tax, whatever you want to call it, but seeing that they're doing not just the right thing, but actually showing that to their investors and their shareholders. And it's a genuine change that I've seen with our clients, probably more genuine than I've seen with other things, other ideas or strategies that have been come either from the regulator or from the banks or central banks. So I certainly see that going in the right direction.
Okay. I've got some more questions down here as well. Gabino, I'm going to come back to you actually, because you talked about blockchain in your session earlier. How can tech like AI and blockchain help you achieve these ESG goals?
Yeah. By the way, I like Sohail's example that even if you're ESG, you got to be profitable, because then what's the whole point, right? And also, I think that what was poignant about what Sohail said earlier is the ESG component is not just, oh, what are you investing in, is what is your company doing, and the entire pipeline, the investor, the capital markets organization, the FinTech company for their own respective employees and the communities they work in. So excellent point. In terms of the AI blockchain component, again, if we have the right data, we have the right metrics, like we can provide that transparency, the beauty of this, and quite frankly, this is exactly what Sapphire is working on, is we'll understand those trading relationships up front. We can talk about what an SG and your investors might be doing in this space. What are those data points? Carry it forward through the life cycle of the fund or the actual trades that are associated to that fund. Blockchain is actually key because in that case, you're truly digitizing the entire data stream. What happens today is when you're doing these trades, and if you want to know if it actually maps to ESG goals, there's a little bit of a handing of the baton between different players along the way, and that's where the data gets lost in translation. If you've got it on a smart contract connected to a blockchain, it all is mapped. It's viewable, but through the entire chain of all the players that are involved, so you get that transparency. So that I think is the goal. And again, still we have to get to the adoption of blockchain to make that possible.
Yeah, I mean, Stephen Roche, I think you said maybe 1 year for blockchain, and Gabino, you said 5 years. So what's a genuine, oh, should we just take in the middle? Are we talking 3 years for blockchain?
Well, so I push the envelope a little bit more than he does probably, and I'm a little bit more optimistic. On the side, you have to get a little presumptive that they're going to be adopting the solution first, and especially we're setting up the foundation for that. I think he's worried about the different types of blockchain. Or you go ahead, you're the product guy.
No, look, we're working with blockchain companies now. It works. It literally works. There's no question that the technology works. I was talking to Elizabeth and a couple other people outside after our talk. It's the culture of these institutions that make it hard. Sorry, Sohail. Where one, they have their own internal infrastructure they want to map to before they worry about adopting blockchain, right? Also, what's their future if they embrace it? Are they going to make themselves obsolete, right? And then they have their technology teams internally that are looking for survival, right? If I tell you the types of budgets that the banks would pay that I used to work at versus what Sapphire actually does, I mean, and I'm not exaggerating, it's a 90% reduction in cost in terms of how we can build faster to market. So it's the cultural things within each of these firms, and then the industry mindset change that has to happen. It's not the fact that the technology is not enabled. I've actually witnessed it myself. So it could happen sooner. Maybe I'm wrong. I'm looking at those barriers that are hard to quantify, which is more around the politics and culture.
Stephen Drury, do you think there are these barriers that Gabino's talking about when it comes to technology and blockchain in particular?
Yeah, the barriers that we had just putting the pre-trade solution in was all because of the politics, really, and listening to legacy vendors that are involved in the industry, right? They say it can't be done this way, and it's really, pardon the French, ass backwards. They started the post-trade, trying to piece things together after a plane crash instead of putting the safety precautions and put in a black box, you would never have that crash, right? So we were just going through that for 5 years. I mean, it could take 5 years on the blockchain. We have shown it. It has worked. I'm optimistic that people are going to embrace it. People like crypto already. That involves blockchain. It's kind of trendy right now. Some firms are creating their own blockchain technology, these financial institutions as well. So I think we may see the innovation a little bit sooner than later. But again, he's the guy who's been in finance for 20 years. I'm just a technology guy from the outside looking in.
Just to quickly defend SG on the blockchain side, this is one part of our strategy. We have built out consortiums, just for your information, with particularly on trade finance. Comgo is a very good example, so you can look that up in terms of it has been done. I don't think there's any doubt as a piece of technology it works. and spinning it up as a proof of concept is easy. It's not a big deal. Creating a token, again, is very easy to do. The question is use cases, right? And the cost of doing it versus the business value. And I think it's part of an overall solution, whereas AI and blockchain together, as well as data, as well as ESG data, and providing that and getting the right value of information alongside boring aspects like API and integration with legacy backends is just as important in order to get a solution out to a client. And that's what we try to do, right, from an SG point of view.
Yeah.
Not an ESG, but from an SG point of view.
SG, yeah, from a SG
With the added
point
value of
view.
ESG.
Yeah.
I think what's interesting there around the use cases, sort of in my experience, especially when I've been experimenting and looking at this, the ability to run in parallel and drive comparison with existing processing cost becomes incredibly important. So I think the application of AI and blockchain, when you look for use cases, you want to find areas that are high cost, there's high room for error, there's a lack of trust between the parties involved, and they're slow. Because generally they are the 3 or 4 things that by applying AI and blockchain to, you can solve for, which is why when you look at things like trade finance, for example, at a global scale across multiple markets between large and small organizations, or even down through the supply chain, then it becomes immeasurably powerful in terms of its ability to de-risk and save money or reduce cost. And I guess I can't think of a large organization right now that is not focused on its cost transformation.
Yeah, I mean, just to summarize a couple of points there. Obviously, there has to be the use case, but it has to make business sense as well, right? There has to be money involved in this. Right, I'm just going to try and wrap this up slightly here. Now, we've obviously talked quite positively about fintechs and about sustainability and their role in that. But what can fintechs actually do better to achieve these goals? I'm going to start with Gabino.
Okay. I mean, I think you have to. What I call it's kind of like a proof of concept. Take a stab at how do you represent the ESG metrics. I hear a lot of examples, and I always default to why don't we just go directly to the customers and hear what 1 or 2 primary customers say. When I say customers in this context, I'm talking more your large asset managers or hedge funds that are looking to communicate this back to their underlying investors. And then put it out there, see people react. It's going to be wrong the first time. It's just the truth, right? When you're ever starting something brand new, you're going to have folks react to it. The problem is that I have, and even entertaining some of that, is the industry and finance in general is always looking for this perception of perfection, right? And people don't understand that everyone wants to go to Hawaii for their vacation, but you got to travel 10 hours on a plane to get there. So there's the journey of arriving to your paradise. And so as you go along, you could get incremental value to getting there. So some fintechs, I think, oversell the point and say, this is the nirvana state, we're at Hawaii already. I think what Sapphire says, okay, we're 2 hours flight in. You're getting to see some of the green, maybe there's some patches of blue, right? And we're getting closer to our destination, but let's get some input from you so that we can actually, even pivot, because most likely where you were targeting to land, it's not exactly where you want to be. Over time, you realize that you got to adjust the sails a little bit to get to where you need to be. So I think that's what fintechs should actually do, is take a chance, start putting out proof of concepts and letting the customers in the marketplace validate the value.
And Stephen Roche, same question. What can fintechs do better?
I just hit on it earlier better because I don't want to repeat what my brother said, but we talked about the technology we bring that just on the sustainability side will do that. So what we're doing better is reducing carbon footprints just with innovative technologies. That's just a must, right? Legacy companies and big corporations probably are going to move a lot slower to make that change, but if they adopt a solution that brings efficiencies for their bottom line, but also contributes to an ESG goal, that's a great thing as well.
I think one more thing to add is evangelization, right? We said that before. So if this is really important, right, like it should be an expectation. Like one of the things that we were talking about during our talk was the principle of interoperability. So these pseudo-monopolies that actually keep their control, how many of the banks, the hedge funds, the asset managers are demanding those vendors to be interoperable? Don't hold my data and documents hostage. every time you meet with those pseudo-monopolies, do you ask them that question to make things interoperable? The individuals at these firms that are our clients at Sapphire, we ask them, be evangelists for this cause. You can take that same attitude with the ESG as well. What are you doing in terms of, and it could be any metric, but once that becomes part of the conversation, you can't ignore it. And so I think if we bring that as part of the facet of the conversation, right, amongst other things, you can make more advancement, even from a FinTech standpoint or any angle for that matter.
And Stephen Jury.
I'll try and keep this as simple as I can. So first of all, I would say create a very clear frame of reference for your business. So what is my purpose and what do I stand for as a FinTech, whatever your business you're in? Secondly is what is it that you're doing for your customers, and is there a way that you can do that differently or better to have a greater impact on an ESG goal? Thirdly is what can you give to your customers so that they can make a change? So I think create the frame of reference around those tiering, I think, is really important. The second one I'd say is learn from others. So I think what I've observed and been part of in the UK is probably one of, if not the most vibrant FinTech scene in the world. Now, it's incredibly collaborative. They help each other. There's very good discussion going. So if there are FinTechs that are actually, by their very design, focused on shifting a goal or an outcome under the ESG umbrella, reach out and have a conversation. Ask them to share how they're going about doing it. Because everything I've seen is that their passion for achieving a better outcome for society will mean they will share in a heartbeat the things that they know to help you go on that journey. So yeah, two things. Frame of reference, kind of your purpose, what you do for your customers, what you can give your customers to change, how can you act there. Second is lean into that community because it will lean back.
Okay, final word, Sahel.
Yeah, just quickly, I think there's two angles for me. One is I think we get a little bit bogged down as being FinTechs as a provider rather than co-creating and co-development, because we do that in-house all the time around co-creation, co-development of ideas, products, whatever client needs are. And I'd like to start seeing with our FinTech relationships being much more on a collaborative basis and co-creation of ideas. And then just going back to the point I made earlier today in the talk that I did this morning, I think on the social side, there's definitely a lot more work that needs to be done on the diversity of some of the boards of both the investors, VC side, but also on the FinTechs as well. I mean, it's a great example with Sapphire that it's not all white, classic male background. So I think that's another big area that needs to be addressed.
Absolutely. And anyone wondering about diversity, by the way, I realise that every speaker so far today has been male. So we haven't been diverse in part one, but the second half this afternoon is all about women in FinTech. So we're redressing the balance there a little bit. Right, we might have time for one question from the floor, but one only. So if there is a burning question, speak now or forever hold your peace. Yes, one question. And if you please state your name and where you're from.
Hi, Shahi Ali, London Stock Exchange Group. Regulators have failed investors over many years. Look at the US regulators and Bernie Madoff. And what I'm seeing is that the regulators are constantly trying to play catch up with FinTechs. They have no idea. What can FinTech do to protect investors?
Yeah, we talked in our talk earlier about partnering with the banks, the institutional firms on the street already, and Sohail had mentioned before, consortiums are also an access point for that. I think, yeah, the regulators work in a bubble. They are playing catch up, and they create unintended consequences and unintended problems. But you need some basic minimum rules to still exist too. So I'm not advocating complete free reign either. I don't want people to walk away with the wrong impression. What FinTechs can do is one, if you're a successful FinTech in the B2B institutional space, then you definitely have relationships with the big institutions already. They should be your clients. Those clients, in some cases, we invite them to advisory boards, right? So they can be our advocates at the regulators. We are currently helping, Sapphire is helping with things in the post-trade space that is actually managed by a little bit of a non-governmental organization that I will not name right now, but you probably know them in the US, that they manage a lot of the settlements. Those institutions, those big banks that Sapphire works with can help actually bridge that and actually evangelize new ways of actually working. So it's really tapping into those networks, if you ask me, that help and because they also have the advocacy to the regulators directly to kind of shine the light on a better way forward. But that's really what it comes down to. Evangelization, networking, working with those institutions that are already connected to the regulators, already connected to those NGOs that are actually providing services in the finance space.
Anybody, anything to add there?
I suppose the thing I would add is probably thinking a little bit about how the FCA in particular have focused and engaged in a lot of the conversation and the need to learn. So I think what you're starting to see is, I guess fintechs aren't just changing the way things that have been done before can be done with a slightly different technology, but in the same way. They're actually pushing the boundaries of how products, services, processes work and operate. And that brings about uncertainty and the need for learning. And anything where there's uncertainty and a need for learning, for me, needs open and transparent discussion about what we're learning and how we best supervise to get to the best outcome. And my experience in engaging with the Sandbox and engaging with Innovate Finance and the steering group and the FinTech delivery panel and the recent Khalifa review is that a lot of these topics are surfaced and the regulators, the Bank of England, are coming to the table and having those conversations. I don't think there's a perfect answer, but what I can see is that technology will only advance faster than the regulation can keep up, and the smaller the delta between the two coming about because we're willing to collaborate, we're willing to share, and we're willing to work out how best to create the controls so it's safe for everyone. That for me is what's critical. So I think it's something that the UK has to continue to incubate and focus on if it wants to stay as a leading player on the global stage.
Okay, we will have to leave it there because we are literally eating and metaphorically eating into our lunch hour. So please thank Gabino, Stephen, and Sohail.